It probably wasn't being Bedford-Stuyvesant. There was an organization of North Carolinians. There's something called the Sons and Daughters of North Carolina, and they met.
Do you know the story of their actual meeting?
Well, I understand they met. They had like a weekly card get together. They play cards and things like that and entertain themselves, and that's where they met. That's my understanding. And for most of his life, he was an auto mechanic until he retired. Matter of fact, he retired out here on Long Island, over in Inwood.
Did,
Yes, when he died, he was living in Inwood. As a matter of fact.
so tell me about your parents. Then you remember your dad. Describe your.
He was
home.
very hardworking man.
Yeah.
He emphasized, well, both he and my mother emphasized the importance of education.
How did they do that?
Well, they did that by, first of all, overseeing, making sure that we got our homework done. My mother would always go up to parent teachers meetings. She was always involved in the school. She was involved in various organizations in the church. My mother did something very affirmatively. She converted to Catholicism, which at that time would allow her children to go to a Catholic school almost free. So she made it an affirmative act. She converted. Interesting enough, she also was the eldest of her siblings, and she had a number of them who also converted because she did. So my parents basically were role models for both sides of the family.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting how that happens. Sometimes people in the same order, birth order, find each other. They have
Right.
Similarities.
They were 2 years apart in age. And again, like I said, my home functioned like a central station for both families coming together. You know what I mean?
Well, so literally were people living in the house too?
Well, we lived in the house. Our immediate family lived in the house, but there were frequent visits by his uncles, her uncles, cousins, relatives. It was like a central station. Like they came to our house more so than we would visit them.
Why? Because they were the two leaders of their family? Is that what you're saying?
I would think so, yes. Now that I look back on, yes, I would say yes. They were, like I said, they were both the eldest of their siblings. And I think the other thing I think is that they served as a role model because my mother and father were together until the death do they part, that type, you know what I mean? And we had a routine. You went to school. Sundays you had to go to church. You had chores to do on Saturday. But to answer your question, they both were attuned to their children being educated. They made that a very important task. So it wasn't a question of if you were going to high school or going to go on to do something else. It was accepted that you would.
I got you. Do you remember moments when either parent said something to you along those lines that really made an impression about why reading or education is important?
Well, my mother, I would always tell people my mother spoke the King's English. She spoke very well, okay? And she, like I said, I think her example, she instilled in us the importance of education. Her involvement with the schools wasn't just tangential. She was involved. She didn't miss parent-teachers meeting night. She was always there. She was always in touch with the nuns. I had nuns, of course. And I think that was the support. That you couldn't go to school and not do your work and your parents not find out. But not only that, I basically would have to speak from my individual observation. There were a lot of books in my house. I would have to say we were very literate. There were a lot of books. My father read 3 or 4 papers on the weekend.
How about African American history or literature?
I learned most of my African American history when I was in high school. When I became attuned to that thing, I went to libraries. I could spend the whole day in the library just reading. That's where I gathered my information.
About racial
African American history and the racial issues in the U.S., yes.
So your parents didn't talk about that as much?
No, what the interesting thing, and I'd like to reinforce this, there was no feeling of, we don't quite match up. See, because the parochial school we went to, there were white and black kids, and there were no distinctions made. I have to say that I didn't really become attuned to racial conflict, so to speak, until I was in high school, and there happened to be a demonstration led by a minister who had a church called Concord Baptist Church, Reverend Galamison. He's a historical figure. When he started his march in the 60s and all, that's when I really became attuned to that. But before that, it really wasn't significant because I didn't feel like I was being denied anything. You got to understand, at that time in central Brooklyn, we had all of our own African American professionals. So we had dentists, doctors, lawyers. There were Jewish doctors in the community also. But as far as the profession, we had all our own profession. We had the merchants. Most of the merchants in our community, immediate community, were African American or Caribbean, or one or two Jewish merchants. But so we had a very self-sustaining community.
So it was very professionalized,
Right.
a lot of successful families.
Yes.
And yet it sounds like it was also predominantly black.
Well, I would have to say it was. At that time, yes, it was.
Do you remember as a child leaving the neighborhood and being aware of your own race?
Well, I was always aware of my race. That's not the issue. Always aware of my race and my background. But those things we were intelligent and articulate enough to speak about. My great-grandmother was, I would say, maybe a quadrant, the Dutch descendant. Okay, so we were aware of those types of things, but we didn't dwell on them.
I see.
We didn't usually let those things kind of hold you back.
Mm-hmm.
We were taught to be competitive.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, if you're familiar with Catholic parochial institutions, they teach competition. Mm. And we had white and black students. So, no, I don't think the environment was such that we were so conscious of any negative aspect of being African American and white society. Other than maybe when I was 1960, I participated in what we call a regent contest, oratorical contest. I competed in, or I was selected from my school to represent them in an oratorical contest we had in Brooklyn for a scholarship. And it dealt with the issue of race because it coincided with the Kennedy campaign. So those issues were alive at that point. Well, they were actually alive before that point. I was aware of the things that happened to Emmett Till and things like that. But the environment wasn't such as to hold you back psychologically. And like I said, materially, we had everything, you could find anywhere else. Movies, professionals in the community.